Hello, today I'm going to be sharing a hands-on tutorial on how to connect and configure MySQL database to a web server. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a VPC. I'm going to be using the VPC and more option. And for this tutorial, the VPC created, I'm going to give it the name tutorial project. I'm going to be using the IPv4 CIDR block, that's 10.0.0.0/16. That's the default for this particular tutorial. And I have two availability zones for this and two public subnets, two private subnets. There is going to be no NAT gateway or VPC endpoint. And I'm going to maintain the settings that enabling the DNS host name and also the DNS resolution. So the VPC has been created now. So the next thing I'm going to do is create a security group. So for this tutorial, I'm going to be creating two security groups. That's the public and the private security group. So this is the public security group. I'm going to give it the name public tutorial project. So I'm using the tutorial project so it's easy for me to identify the VPC from the default VPC. In this option, I'm going to select the VPC I created. And I'm going to be creating an inbound rule for the SSH. Please note that the inbound rule is more like an IP address used to connect to the EC2 instance because this security group being created is for the EC2 instance. That's why it's the public security group. So for this particular connection, I'm going to be creating one for SSH, HTTP, and HTTPS. And as you can see, I'm connecting the sources directly to the ISP. That's the internet service provider. So that's why it's on a 0000/0. So the security group has just been created. So the next thing I'm going to do now is create another security group. And this time it's going to be a private security group for the database. That's MySQL database. So as you can see here, I'm giving the name of the security group being created as public for easy identification. So now I'm creating the private security group for MySQL database. So I'm going to give the name private tutorial project. And the same applies with the description. I'm just going to be removing the hyphen. So for the VPC, I'm going to be selecting the one I created, that's the tutorial project. And for this inbound rule, the connection is going to be from the MySQL/Aurora, and the source is going to be to the security group I created. That's to the public security group created. So there's going to be no outbound rule except the default one. So I'm going to go ahead and create the security group for MySQL database. So the next thing we're going to be doing now is creating a subnet group. So the subnet group will be useful in creating the database for easy identification because I'm going to be connecting it to the VPC created. So to create a subnet group, I have to go to RDS, and to the left hand pane, I'm just going to scroll down and you can see the subnet group. So for this subnet group, I'm going to be calling it Private Subnet Database Tutorial Project. And the description is going to be same. So I'm going to be connecting now with the VPC created, and I'm going to be using two availability zones. That's the A and B. The reason for using A and B is because it has to be the same as the subnet created while creating the VPC. If you notice, while creating the VPC earlier, we selected two availability zones where we have two public zones, where we have two public subnets and two private subnets. So these two subnets are located in the availability zone. That's the US East 1A and 1B. So I'm going to show that shortly. There's a bit of a lag in the video, so please bear with me. As you can see, that's the public subnet created and it's under the US East 1A, same as the private. So I'm going to scroll down and check for the other subnets created to just confirm that they are under the US East 1A and 1B respectively. As you can see, the public subnet is under 1B and same as the second private subnet. So I'll go ahead and copy this private subnet ID in a WordPad. So I'm going to copy both private subnets. That's the one in the US East 1A and 1B. So I'm just going to save that in a WordPad for future reference. Yeah, so I'm going to be selecting under add subnet in the subnet group creation. I'm going to be selecting the private subnet created while creating the VPC. So I'm just going to cross check the information with what I have in the WordPad. So this is the private subnet for the first, that's the first subnet created, which is under 1A. And this is the second private subnet created under 1B. So I'll go ahead and create this subnet group. So now we'll be moving to the main work, which is creating the EC2 instance and the database. So the first thing we're going to be creating after this is the EC2 instance. I'm going to be using the Amazon Linux 2. So I'm going to be giving the name of this EC2 instance web server tutorial project. The tutorial project is just for easy identification. Like I said earlier, I'm going to be using the Amazon Linux 2, and I'm going to proceed to create a key pair. The name of this key pair is going to be called tutorial, and the key pair just allows for connection using SSH, or if you're using PuTTY. If you're using PuTTY, you have to use the .ppk. So now I'm going to edit the network settings, where I'm going to be selecting the VPC I created, and I'm also going to be selecting the public subnet. So that was automatically filled. So we can see that we have the public subnet. Please note that the availability zone for my EC2 instance will be the same as my database. That's my SQL database. So I'm going to be using 1A for both the EC2 instance and for database I'm going to be creating. Now I'm going to be selecting the existing security group created, which is the public tutorial project, which has the inbound rule for the SSH, the HTTP, and the HTTPS. So I'm just trying to cross check if there's any other information I need to update. So I'm going to maintain the default settings and launch my instance. While we wait for the instance to be available, we're going to now proceed to create our database. So I'm going to be creating MySQL database, and this is going to be done by going to RDS. RDS is the Relational Database Service. So to create a database, you can click on database on the left hand side, and you get the option to create database on the right hand side. So wait for that to load up. Now we can see that the EC2 instance created is now running. So I'm just going to check the connection to be sure that it's connecting to the internet and there's no connection issue. Yes, so this is working fine. So now we'll proceed to the RDS and create MySQL database. So I'm going to be selecting the MySQL database option. That's MySQL. I'm going to be using the default version. I'm going to also be using the free tier for this tutorial. The name of the database instance is going to be Database Tutorial Project for easy identification. I'm going to maintain the master username, which is admin, and I'll be creating my password manually. So for this tutorial, I'm just going to be using a easy password, but for if you're going to be creating something else for an organization, it has to be a very good password, if you get what I mean. So this also, I'm going to be retaining the default setting for enabling auto scaling. Every other setting is going to be default, but I'm going to be changing the VPC because I'm going to be selecting the one I created. That's the tutorial project. For the public access, I'm going to be selecting the no option. And for the security group, I'm also going to be selecting the existing security group. which is the private tutorial project. For the availability zone, like I said earlier, I'm going to be using the US East 1A. As you can see, it's the same thing with the EC2 instance created. I'm going to maintain all other default settings. Under the additional configuration, I'm going to be putting sample as the initial database name. This is going to come in handy when we're trying to install and connect to the web server. There's a bit of error trying to create database, so I have to change the password to ensure that they both match. So we're going to proceed now to create the database. Creating the database actually takes a longer time compared to the EC2 instance. So while that is being created and also being backed up, we're going to now proceed with installing Apache web server on the Linux instance created. We're going to be connecting back to the EC2 instance, that's Linux, and we're going to install the Apache web server. So for this, we're going to be using the AWS command to install the Apache server. So I'm going to be using a documentation provided by AWS to install a web server on your EC2 instance. So the first thing we're going to do here is get the latest bug fixes and security updates. So we have the sudo yum update space -y command for this. So I'm going to be copying that and pasting it on my Linux. And we can see no package marked for update. So the Linux is up to date. The next thing we're going to be doing now is installing the PHP software, and we're going to be doing that using the Amazon Linux extra install command. So I'm just going to copy that and paste in my Linux. So because there's no error in this, we're going to proceed now to install the Apache web server. So as you can see, I'm going to copy this and paste on Linux as well. So I'm copying
So as you can see, it's still
AWS.
installing.
So it's currently being installed. So the next stage is to start the web server.
Copy the next command,
using
which
the
is to
sudo
start
system ct1 start
the web server.
httpd.
Okay, so I'm just going to check
So to
to see that the connection goes through.
working, that's the
Most
Apache
times it might not go through. I've tried. I tried creating a demo earlier, and I tried to just do a test, but it did not connect.
So I'm going to connect using HTTP.
Yeah, like I said.
Because while I tried,
but it doesn't mean that it's not running, because it actually
error.
is
So I tried
running.
using HTTP.
Yep. So as you can see here,
we have the test
the
page for
Apache
which
web
shows
server
that
is installed.
our connection is good and the Apache was successfully installed.
So I'll just close this. And
so the next thing we're going to be doing now is configuring the web server.
To also check in case you get that error,
and this configuration is to start
you can also check
system
for
boot using the system
updates.
ct1 command. So what I was trying to do here was to check if there was an update, but the command I used was not the right command. So kindly disregard this part, that's the system ctynum update command I was trying to run. That was just a flop on my head.
So skip that part.
We're going to proceed with the configuration of the web server to start with each system group using the system ctynum command. So to avoid having to go back to the error, I had to clear previous commands to give us a clean slate. So I just copied the command for configuration of the web server and I'm pasting it on Linux. So that went through fine. So the next thing we're going to be doing now is to set file permissions for the Apache web server. So I'm going to be adding the EC2 user to the Apache group. And there's a command for this when you go to the install a web server on AWS documentation. You find all those commands there. So after adding the EC2 user, I'm going to exit and try to connect back to Linux. So as you can see now, I'm trying to connect back to the Linux instance. And I'm just going to check to verify that the Apache group exists by typing groups. And we can see that we have the EC2 user admin will Apache system D journal as seen in the journal, as seen in the documentation. That's the AWS documentation. So the next thing we're going to do is change the group ownership to the var/www directory and its contents to the Apache group. And we have a command for that. So I'll just copy and paste. So the next thing is to change the directory permission of the var/www and its subdirectories to add group right permission and set the group ID on subdirectories created in the future. So that went with no error. The next thing we're going to be doing is recursively changing the permission for files in the var/www directory and its subdirectories to add group right permissions. So I'm going to copy that command and I'm going to paste it in my Linux instance. So now the EC2 user can actually delete, add and edit files in the Apache document root using the command I created. Sorry, I didn't create that. The command I just ran on the Linux instance. So what we're going to be doing now is connecting our web server to the database instance, which is MySQL. So I'm going to ensure that my SQL database is up and running. I think it should be up and running by this time. So I'm just going to refresh this page and check to see that the database is up and running. So now we're going to add content from the Apache web server that connects to the MySQL database created. And we're going to do that by first, while connected to the EC2 instance, we're going to change the directory to the var/www and create a new subdirectory called inc. So I'm going to be using the command. Then that went through. The next thing we're going to be doing now is creating a file in the inc directory named dbinfo.inc, and then we're going to edit the file by calling nano. So you can either use Nano or use VI. So this is where it gets tricky because you have to update because you're trying to connect the server to the database at this point. So we're going to be using the database created. We're going to be using the database instance endpoint. So I'm going to go to the RDS and I'm going to copy the endpoint for the MySQL database that I created. And we're also going to be using the master password which was created while creating the SQL database. And I'm going to input the information in this command. You can see the command here. So I'm just going to, where we have the red marks, we're going to put in the endpoint, that's the database instance endpoint, and also the master's password. So I'm going to be using my WordPad to edit this. I'm going to be copying the endpoint for the MySQL database, and I already know the password, so I'm just going to edit the information and I'm going to be pasting that on my nano file. Then I'll proceed to save and exit, and I'm doing this by, I'm going to save by clicking on Control and O, that's Control O, and to exit you click on enter after the Control O, and then you go to Control X to exit. So we can see the nano file name. So the next thing we're going to do now after that is to change the directory to var/www/html. So we're going to be using the command created by AWS in this doc. So after that, we're going to now create a new file in the HTML directory named samplepage.php. And then we're going to edit the file by calling nano. So after calling nano, we're going to copy the HTML content provided in the doc, that's the AWS doc, and we're going to be pasting it in the nano file created. Then we're going to save and exit. So the way to save is Control O, then we click on enter when the name of the file comes up, and then we Control X to exit. So after exiting, we're done with the connection. So we're just going to verify now that the connection was successful. How are we going to do this? We're going to do this by browsing http:// the EC2 instance endpoint /samplepage.php. So I'm going to copy the EC2 instance in a WordPad or a sticky note, and I'm just going to edit that information. Then I'm going to be pasting in my web browser. Thank you very much for taking your time to view this video to this point. And we're almost at the end of the hands-on tutorial. So the next thing we're going to do now is just edit the information, and then we'll be pasting that information in our web server. So I'm going to be copying the public IPv4 DNS, and I'm just going to edit that with the information provided in the AWS doc, and we're pasting that in the web browser. Yeah, so I just pasted that information and it went through. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.